been looking at the reports that were collected in regard to the Tully case, and she's found some very interesting things about that. Plus, the lady who actually sent a lot of those reports to us, Claire Noble, who was a UFO researcher, she died in November 2014, and so her records were sent to us to hold for her in posterity. I believe you've included some new photos that people haven't seen before.
So this is called Tully Revisited. So we will go through the Tully Saucer Nest event in a small way. I'll introduce a few other items about the event that people might not know. Colin Phillips is in our audience. He knows a lot about Tully, so if I get stuck, I'll just ask him. Hope his memory is good. He's looking at me very worriedly. No, it's okay. Colin actually co-authored a little report for the group. So just before we go on, a little bit about UFO Research Queensland, which back in the Tully days was called the Queensland Flying Saucer Research Bureau, which was a mouthful, and it took them 20 years to figure something else out. But in those days, flying saucers was what you called them. And that's a lovely display of the logos we've had over the years. Isn't that beautiful? This is the current one. What's next? Sorry, I have to laugh. This is Queensland. Okay, you all know where we are. But in case you don't, that's where we are, the big orange spot. This is one of those lovely 1960s prints that they used to put on tea towels that show you where everything is made. So, this year, being 2016, is not only a milestone for UFO Research Queensland, which was established in 1956, but it's also a milestone for Tully, which happened in 1966. So it's been 50 years since then. As it turns out, as I was going through the sighting reports, 1966 was a highlight year in UFOs, and possibly we don't realise that today. So I'd like you to cast your mind back to what Queensland must have been like back then. It's a pretty dinky little place now, according to everyone in Melbourne and Sydney, and probably other places. Imagine how fast it took for news to get across the country. There was no internet. We had the telegraph, we had newspapers. Television didn't come to Brisbane until 1959, and it didn't get up to Townsville, in the Tully area, until 1962. So there wasn't much on TV. Probably nobody had a TV, and there probably were 3 television stations, if that, maybe 1 or 2, I don't know. So information didn't get around fast. Possibly back then, when the reports were coming into the UFO research group, they didn't understand or realise the significance of them. I think possibly only now, when you look back at them, do you see the bigger pattern, and that's what I'm hopefully going to present tonight. Hopefully. So the saucer nest was found on January 19, 1966. This is where Tully is. I'll get this little mouse. Obviously Tully's here, the Horseshoe Lagoon is here, and it's not far off the Bruce Highway. So at 9 o'clock in the morning, on Wednesday, January 1966, it was a hot sunny morning. George Pedley, who was 28 years old at the time, and he was a banana farmer, he was driving his tractor across the property of his neighbour Albert Panisi, and he was driving past the Horseshoe Lagoon. Now Google Maps tells me this is the Horseshoe Lagoon, but it might not be. It could be any old Horseshoe Lagoon, really. Okay, the track along which George drove his tractor passed alongside the lagoon, which was dry for part of every year. Tully is also known as the wettest town in Queensland, and there's a big gumboot there if anyone goes. That's in commemoration of the wettest town, the giant gumboot. So in the summer of 1966, when the rains came, it had about 1.5 metres of water in the lagoon, and the water was full of reeds that rose about 0.5 metre above the lagoon. So as George drove along the track, he thought he could hear a misfire in his tractor. He tried to figure out what was making the sound. There was a hissing sound as well that he thought was coming from a tyre, and as he was leaning forward listening to the tractor, a grey saucer-shaped object rose from the lagoon, tilted a little to one side, and then shot off towards the southwest at phenomenal speed. The object was approximately 7 to 8 metres in diameter, 3 metres thick in the centre, and blue-green colour. So George jumped from the tractor immediately. He saw this and ran to the lagoon and saw a large circular area of rotating water that was completely dry of reeds. So to quote George, and this is George's words, "When I glanced at it, it was already 30 feet above the ground and at about treetop level. It was large, grey, saucer-shaped, convex on the top and bottom, and measured 25 feet across and 9 feet high. While I watched, it rose another 30 feet, spinning very fast. Then it made a shallow dive and took off with tremendous speed. Climbing at an angle of 45 degrees, it disappeared within seconds in a southwesterly direction. Okay, so George ran to the lagoon, saw this circular patch of rotating water, went back to the tractor, which started, and continued on his way. Later that afternoon, or later that morning, same morning, he was going back past the lagoon and had another look. So he found a swirled mass of reeds that had floated to the surface since that morning. The reeds were swirled in a circular pattern in an anti-clockwise manner, and they were green at that time. About mid-afternoon, George returned to the lagoon with Albert Panisi, who owned the property, and the reeds had turned brown by then and seemed to be dead. So that's a photograph of the nest. That's one photograph of the nest. So Albert waded out into the lagoon and discovered it was possible to swim beneath that nest, the swirled mass of reeds, and the water was clear. The most interesting feature of the top of the nest was what some people claim was the impression of the UFO that was left on the surface. So there's a better photo there. That's George Pedley wading out to the nest, which he obviously did for photographic purposes later. Here's another photo of the nest, and you can see there's a dint here. It comes up and then dints down again. And when I was looking at this, which is a better picture than we've had before, I saw this little dude smiling on the other side, so I've given you a close-up. I don't know who he is or what he's laughing at, but I guess he's been recorded for all posterity. He could be one of those strange Yari creatures kidnapping people and folding their clothes up. I don't know. Sorry. Okay. So, there's George in front of the nest. And I do like how men dressed in the 60s. I think shorts and long socks should come back. Exploration of the area around the lagoon. Okay, we're heading into wacky territory now. Sorry. Exploration of the area around the lagoon led to the discovery of what appeared to be two sets of footprints. So I don't know if anyone's heard of the footprints before. Okay, they led from the nest and extended into a nearby field. They were found in recently ploughed dirt, were small and oddly shaped, about 10 centimetres long and 5 centimetres across. Unfortunately, the prints were destroyed over the next few days by the hordes of sightseers that came to look at the nest. So back in the same day that they found the nest, 7:30 that night, Albert and George contacted the police. The police didn't come until the next morning, January 20, and they promptly passed the case over to the Australian Air Force, the RAAF. Before the police passed the case over, though, they found two more nests smaller than the original, in one of which the reeds were swirled counterclockwise. There were even what appeared to be burns in the smaller nests. Samples of the nests were apparently sent to the physics department at University of Queensland, but nothing obvious or unusual was detected, they said. The United States Navy also showed an interest after similar nests were found in the States, apparently. They also obtained grass samples from the nest, and the results not been made public. So the media were alerted to the event, and hordes of reporters, investigators and sightseers tramped over the area, destroying any evidence that might have been discovered by researchers. However, all these sightseers had great ideas about what might have caused the nests. So the lists included helicopters, willy-willies, birds, crocodiles and grubs, I don't know how, none of which proved plausible, especially in light of George's close encounter. But the one thing the sightseers did do was discover 3 more nests in the area. So the total nests found at that time were 6. So here's some more newspaper articles. Note the US Navy in that one. Despite the peculiarity of the nest and the unlikelihood that natural forces were at work, the RAF decided that it was a willy-willy that caused the multiple phenomenon. Now I'd like to go on a bit about willy-willies here. Has anyone had experience of willy-willies close up? Yes, I drove my car through one once on purpose, and it was the most awesome thing ever. Went flying sideways across the road, but didn't leave a circle on my car. Okay, they don't usually form over wetlands because they're a hot, the differential between the ground and the atmosphere sucks them up. They don't hover in one place. They're like tornadoes. They rip grass and other objects violently out of the ground, and they don't flatten them into pretty circles. So if a willy-willy can make a circle like that, then a tornado is going to leave beautiful patterns across the middle of the Americas, because apparently that's what they do. So something that people might not have known was back in 1947, when Albert and his wife visited the farm prior to purchasing it, they observed large revolving beams of light that shone up from sky from further away on the property. Albert climbed onto the roof of the shed to get a better look at the lights. He couldn't find out what they were, but he described it as looking like a battleship sailing across his property. So therefore, the saucer nest of 1966 was not the first time that Albert's farm had been the focus of interesting activity. So back in 1966, we had the saucer nest. In February 1968, a battery-operated monitor with a movie camera attached was installed at the lagoon by the members of the Queensland Flying Saucer Research, I'll never get that right, Bureau. A few weeks after the installation, on March the 4th, the device was triggered and 50 feet of 8mm film was exposed. Interestingly, that date, March 4th, 1968, coincided exactly with the news item broadcast by radio station 4KZ that reported an airliner departing out of Cairns had been paced at an altitude of 6,000 feet by a UFO that was estimated to be flying another 2,000 feet above it. Both pilots witnessed the craft, which paced the plane until it reached the Cooktown area, which is about 290 kilometres north of Tully, whereupon the UFO broke off and accelerated away at a speed estimated by the pilots to be 1,500 miles an hour, which in our miles is 2,400 kilometres an hour. I don't know how they got that estimation, but I'd say it was pretty damn fast. Back on the Penisi farm, the film was removed from the camera in the presence of witnesses and sent to Kodak in Melbourne for testing. 10 days later, Kodak wrote back to say the film canister had arrived empty. So somewhere between the posting of the canister and its arrival in Melbourne, the film disappeared. So the police were notified of this event. The Queensland Flying Saucer Research Bureau Committee were very upset by this. So upset that they even hired a barrister to write to the Minister of the Air and demand the return of the film. So for some reason, they pinpointed the Ministry of Air. The Minister didn't reply for 6 months. And on August 29th, he stated that they didn't know the fate of the film and denied the department had removed any film from Kodak. It's entirely possible this is a truthful statement and that they had no knowledge of who did remove the film. But to add even more mystery to this, on March the 13th, 9 days after the camera was triggered at the Penisi farm, and probably about the same time that Kodak were getting that empty canister in the mail, 2 RAAF helicopters were observed inspecting the lagoon for a significant length of time. Albert Penisi, as well as having the camera installed at the lagoon, also had a UFO monitoring device installed at his house. So less than a year after the 1968 event with the missing film, on February the 8th, 1969 at 5:30 a.m, the UFO monitoring device in the Penisi home was triggered. When Albert went out to the lagoon, he found a fresh nest at the southern end. The new nest was much larger than the original of 1966, measured 29 feet across, and like its predecessor was perfectly circular in shape. A second nest was found later that day at the northern end of the lagoon, much smaller but with the same characteristics of the larger nest. Above the smaller nest hung the branch of a tree that had a section of leaves that appeared to have been scorched. So, Mr. Penisi informed no one outside the Queensland Flying Saucer Research Bureau of this new nest, so the only tracks in the area were his and the investigators. Grass samples from the second nest were tested for radiation again by the Queensland University Physics Department. He reported virtually no radiation. One botanist said that the reeds have died of natural causes, another said there was no chance of it being a natural death. So that's the basics of the Tully nest. The very basics. We do have more information if anyone wants to read it. Colin's report is in the library. There's a DVD over there as well. It's very interesting. However, that's not just the interesting bit. This piece of paper is George Pedley's report to the Queensland Flying Saucer Research Bureau. He had a close encounter sighting where a UFO rose up in front of his tractor, and that's what he sent in. Most of the answers are no. The man must have been very quiet. He just gives the date of the sighting, how big it was, the colour it was, and everything else was no, no, no signed. However, he did include a sketch. So that's George's sketch, signed by him, as you can see. Albert Penisi wrote a letter to the Queensland Flying Saucer Research Bureau to discuss more about the lagoon, and I'll just read you a section or two sections of this. Okay, I will hereby try to describe to you the nature of the lagoon. It's not very large, covers about half an acre, and is almost dry 3 months of the year, and has little or no bird life, which is very strange for a lagoon. We had good rain in December 1965 and the lagoon's half filled. After the object had risen, the reeds were still green, George said, but when he returned in the afternoon they were dry. I saw the nest at 5:30 the same day and it looked like a circle of dried reeds. It leaves no doubt in my mind that something caused the reeds to dry up. To answer your questions regarding George Pedley, he is a quiet, spoken, honest and level-headed man, and as according to that report back there, doesn't like to write much either. He doesn't wear spectacles and his eyesight is good. George's position was between the object and the sun, facing the object with his back more or less to the sun. He had a clear, unimpeded view. The object moved upwards for approximately 60 feet, then tilted slightly and veered off to the southwest at great speed. Albert's letter continues. Here is something more we didn't mention at the time because we were not sure what made the footprints and we thought the police would take over all investigations. But unfortunately they were reluctant to even view the saucer nest. And by the time they arrived at 8 a.m. on Thursday, the 20th of January, the footprints were well trodden over by the people who had come to see the nest. As we had no further proof, we thought the least said the better. However, I will attempt to draw you a diagram, which there it is, and you will see for yourself how improbable they would look in newsprint, with no one to say they had also seen them. The prints appeared directly one in front of the other and approximately 10 inches apart. Okay, a letter from Frank Evans. Colin, did you know Frank Evans? No? Okay. He was around in 1966. So Frank Evans was a member of the Queensland Flying Saucer Research Bureau and he visited the farm in July 1966. And he provides some further information on the footprints. Okay, Albert told me one thing which he stated he had passed on, but I had not heard of it. So even within the Queensland Flying Saucer Research Bureau, they weren't talking about these footprints. The information didn't come out till much later. Okay, at the time when the object landed, he found further over on the dry land near the lagoon 2 more circles approximately 8 feet in diameter. In addition, on the side of the lagoon, on a small track near the big saucer, were 2 sets of imprints in the mud about 4 inches apart. We can only assume they were made by the occupants of the UFO. However, from the other side of the lagoon, leading right up to where the 2 smaller UFOs landed, were identical imprints, these being 4 inches apart, with 8 inches spacing, and then another 2 spaced 4 inches apart, and so on. I immediately asked Albert if he had taken a plaster cast, and he said no, that he had told the police and anticipated they would take full charge. The mystery footprints are a detail of the Tully event that's not widely circulated, or was not, either because it wasn't believed they could possibly be footprints, because that would raise the extremely uncomfortable notion that there were occupants of these crafts, or because there was no substantiating proof of their evidence. Interesting then that a similar saucer nest, complete with mysterious footprints, was reported from Eudlo on the Sunshine Coast, which is not far from here, in 1959, just 3 years after the first Tully nest of 1966, and just 1 month after the nest of February 1969 was discovered. So here's the Eudlo report, which is verbatim. One morning my daughter heard our dog and a neighbour's dog both doing a lot of barking. The next day I found footprints in the shed. These measured 8 and 9 inches in length. The 8-inch marks took a step 16 inches in length. On looking for further evidence, I found something had been in the dam about 80 yards from the house. The grass and reeds were flattened on one side in a clockwise direction. Others were pushed away from the centre on the other side of the dam. The dam was very dirty, as if the mud had been sucked up from the bottom. The area mostly affected suggests a circular object about 17 feet in diameter. I find this very interesting. So we're going back to Tully now. This is Tully, just to give you a bit of information on what Tully was like back then. It's about 140 kilometres south of Cairns and 200 kilometres north of Townsville. And interesting, we had just had a report from Cairns. It's situated at the foothills of Mount Tyson. Remember that name, Mount Tyson, to the east and Mount Mackay to the north. Its main industries in 1966 were centred on banana and sugarcane cultivation, as well as some citrus, I believe. So there's a picture of Tully from the 1960s. Look at those lovely cars. This is Mount Tyson here. Note how close it actually is to the town. It's not like it's in the distance. It's right there. When they say Tully is at the foothills, it's in the foothills. And I did not swear then. I wanted to use an expletive to accentuate how close to the foothills it is, but I did not. Okay, just a little bit more information about Tully, which I don't know, and I'm not saying anything, may or may not be connected to UFOs. But the Australian Field Experimental Station, has anyone heard of that? It was established in 1943 in Proserpine, had a staff of 500 people drawn from the Allied forces. Their MO was to participate in experiments and simulated attacks involving poison gas. The Allied forces had members of the Australian Army, the Air Force, the Royal Army Medical Corps, British Australian scientists, the Australian Chemical Defence Board, the US Army, the South African Army and the New Zealand Navy. So their mandate was to determine the effects of poisonous gases on personnel and equipment in tropical conditions. Chemical warfare trials were conducted in the Tully rainforest, and after the trials, the volunteers or victims were hospitalised in a special ward on top of Innisfail Hospital, where the staff were ordered to secrecy. Also, the Jungle Wing training area was established for jungle warfare training purposes at Ravenshoe, and jungle warfare also took place in the Tully rainforest, particularly during the Vietnam War, which Australia entered in 1962. So we have a rainforest crawling with military personnel in the 1960s. And as I said, I don't think there's any connection, but I bet there's some interesting stories to be found if we could find those jungle warfare people. Okay, here we are back at the town, and this is Mount Tyson, and again, note how close Mount Tyson is to the town. You can practically see the leaves on the trees. So on March the 27th, 1966, 2 months after the discovery of the saucer nest, a letter was forwarded to the Bureau by J.M. Scott, also of Tully. The letter was handwritten on 5-line pages with accompanying sketches and included a number of sightings witnessed by the Scotts between, March the 15th and the 22nd, 1966. So I've included them because I'd like you to pay attention. So the Scotts were very good observers. They did very good diagrams of what they were looking at, and they saw a lot of interesting things. So on March the 15th, 1966, obviously a brilliantly lighted object travelled in a direct line, seemed close and well above the trees on the mountain. The skies were clear of mist and clouds. It disappeared behind Mount Tyson. Now, as I mentioned, this is not miles in the distance, this is really close to the town. Here's another one, Friday, March the 8th, 1966, a pulsating glowing light left of Mount Tyson. It glowed and pulsated for around 15 minutes, changed to a reddish colour, and then 3 fingers or beams of light seemed to come down underneath the light. Then it changed again, and 3 round holes glowed in a semicircle like the portholes of a boat. The object stayed like that for a few minutes, and then the pulsating started again. It was well above treetop level and stayed there 10 minutes and went out. Okay, March the 19th, the flying object was sighted in the sky south of Tully. Pulsated. I mean, we've seen all these reports over the years, we've heard them all before, but here they were in Tully. The light was white like a neon light, and it disappeared behind Mount Tyson. A day later, a very bright light appeared to the north of Mount Tyson, hovered, and then went out for about a minute. A few seconds later, it came on again. It seemed to come up from behind the mountain, then went out after hovering well above the mountain. It was there for about 4 minutes. Again, I'd just like to reiterate, if they say they saw something in front of, disappearing behind the mountain, they had a very good view of it. At 25 minutes to 8, I sighted a travelling object directly over the Tully township. It was fairly large as the brightest planet. It pulsated and travelled high up and then finally disappeared over the mountains in the north. Later that night, I observed a smaller light nearly overhead the Tully township. Pulsated slowly and steadily until it disappeared behind Mount Tyson. Okay, March the 28th, the UFO was seen on the northern side of Mount Tyson, and that's a very good likeness of the mountain, as you can see on the sketch. Hovered for 10 minutes before moving lower down the mountain and heading in the direction of the Tully township. And here's more, a yellowish white object travelling from south to north. A brilliant white neon light was seen zigzagging at 90 degree. I can't even speak English anymore. Anyway, it did that above Mount Tyson. And again, there's a picture of Mount Tyson. There's more, a yellow to red object with a tail as thick as a man's arm, which is significantly large if you're looking at it. Was observed high over Mount Tyson and travelling many hundreds of miles per hour. And on April 21st, a large round yellowy white light was observed dropping in stages towards the west. The lighted UFO would suddenly drop a few hundred feet, then remain motionless, then fall down again. So yellow lights seem to be the mainstay of the mystery object observed by the Scots over Mount Tyson. And further objects were seen by them on April 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 28th, 29th and 30th. The objects were seen sporadically during May, after which nothing was seen until June of 1966. Okay, in case you think the Scots were the only people seeing things over Tully, there were other reports being received during 1966. These reports include September the 7th, a huge gold moon-shaped object that changed shape to a gold saucer-like object was observed over Mount Tyson again at 7:30 p.m. The object had bright red, green and yellow lights. Okay, this is interesting. A vapour object about 30 feet high was seen as ascending, going up from the top of Mount Tyson at the northwest end. This was seen during daylight hours at 12 noon. It was conical in shape and tapered straight up in the sky before disappearing. And in late September, the yellow object made another appearance, appearing above the mountain where it was seen twice that night, and it was observed again on September the 28th and October the 1st. Okay, on September the 26th, two men on a sugar locomotive observed a large bright UFO rise up from a hill at the southern side of Mount Mackay and hover, then rise up again to approach them from the south. It pulsated and deviated during its flight, then changed direction to head to the northeast where it disappeared. Okay, this one's interesting. On November of 1966, Mr. Atkinson of the Lincoln Springs station reported that three of his stockmen went for a short drive after dinner to the station's aerodrome and returned claiming they'd seen a saucer-shaped object landed on the aerodrome field. They stopped their car about 150 yards from the object and extinguished their headlights. Although they could only see the top portion of the object, they estimated it was about 45 feet long and they could see windows around the top section with lights flashing on and off. The station owner reported that they seemed frightened, which was enough to convince him that they'd seen something peculiar. And he decided to drive out and have a look for himself, but as is always the case when he got there, it was gone. Non-human beings were also reported seen in Tully. During 1966, unfortunately, the reports didn't provide much information on what months these beings were seen. However, the accounts should be included as part of the picture of what was happening in Tully. Two of the reports note that beings were seen in the Tully area. That's it. The third report stated that a man witnessed a landed craft and two beings wearing silver diver-type suits in the rainforest at Ingham. I don't know if he meant like a bell diving suit or a skin diving suit, but they had silver suits. So, prior to 1966, we've just done bits of 1966. By the way, I've written an enormous article about this which will appear in the journal, so you'll need to subscribe if you want to read it. So, was 1966 the only year that the UFO-nauts were visiting Tully? Turns out they were not. 10 years earlier, in 1956, 10 to 12 people witnessed a large cigar-shaped object high in the sky, standing on its end, appear almost directly overhead. It was about 2/3 the size of the moon and was outlined by a silvery halo effect. It remained vertical and of the same apparent size throughout the duration of the sighting. The same object was reported by two timber cutters over the Kuranda area. No sound was reported in either case. In 1957, a pyramid of small lights with the brightest light at the apex was seen above Cairns Airport by policemen, officials and civilians. And this is my favourite one, and I'd like you to pay attention to this because it will return later to haunt us. Okay, September 1959, a young farmer named Max was finishing work at dusk when he saw a large ice cream cone shaped craft only 2 chains away. Isn't it nice? I didn't know what a chain was till I read this. It's about 40 metres. It's about 20 feet above the ground, so 1 chain above the ground, and just above the cane. It remained stationary for about 30 seconds and then took off at an angle and was gone in a few seconds. Max said all the colours of the spectrum were observed rolling around inside the craft at the time. So remember that as well. Max's mother added that he'd come in very frightened after the incident and she herself had wondered why the house had been lit up with such a glow. She also added that at Dalby, which is a long way southwest of Tully, 2 days later, a craft the same the one as Max had seen was reported by a farmer. So in 1959 in Mount Molloy, a ball of light brighter than the moon was seen travelling over the towns of Mount Molloy, Mareeba, Innisfail, Ingham and Townsville. So it had a lot of witnesses. It then turned and headed west towards Hewenden. It was seen for about half an hour from 7 to 7:30. It was also reported to have stopped for a few seconds over a mountain near Ingham. Cardwell in 1959, Cardwell? The area became, well, that's bad English. A man became suddenly aware of UFO landing behind him. There's no further details. It landed behind him. He tossed his chainsaw into the back of his car and fled. Okay, in Dimboola, we're jumping ahead now to a couple of years before Tully. A tobacco farmer on the Walsh River witnessed a projectile-looking object shining like gold or brass pass overhead. He thought it landed in the sandbed of the river, but on investigating found nothing. Mount Carbine the same time, 2 men, one a photographer, the other a pilot, were camped by the road overnight north of Mount Carbine. They were awakened by an object passing overhead and making a rhythmic chuff-chuffing sound. They said it definitely was not an aircraft. Kuranda in 1964, a family of tobacco farmers saw a bright star-like object approaching their house from the northwest. Coming closer, the object grew larger, although the light it emitted became more diffused. The object stopped when it came near the house and turned off its external light system to reveal an enormous cigar-shaped mass floating a few hundred feet above the ground. Many rows of small round portholes were visible as an internal light rippled along them. After a minute or more, the external light came on again and the object receded into the distance. Approximately 20 minutes later, the object appeared again from the opposite direction and repeated the same performance. So that object was seen by 10 people. So in 1965, Mr. O'Brien and his family were visiting a neighbouring farm at 9 a.m. in the morning when they observed a large cigar-shaped craft floating out of a mountain gorge about 8 miles to their east. Following the object came 9 smaller discoid objects in groups of 3. The enormous cigar-shaped object floated between the witnesses and the nearby mountain range and was estimated to be about 1 mile in length. It cruised slowly for about 20 minutes, at one time passing behind a cloud bank where they could see the glow through the clouds, and during that time the 9 smaller discs were seen darting in and out of the gorges. That was a daylight sighting with 12 witnesses. So we're getting a picture here. This is a very peculiar place to be. This is also a good sighting from Mackay. In 1965, May 23rd, an object shaped like a bucket with legs was observed from the Retreat Hotel on the mail route to Mackay. It was watched for 40 minutes by a number of witnesses, including a commercial pilot. Okay, when they first saw it, it was on the ground, not far from the front of the hotel, supported by its 3 legs. It had several banks of orange lights, a plate on top, about 30 feet diameter. It was observed for 40 minutes, during which time the police were called. And by the way, the report notes the police had hysterical laughter when they were called, and some discussion was made regarding shooting at it, which they decided not to do in case it shot back. That's a diagram by one of the witnesses. The craft then rose to hover to a height of about 200 metres. 3 bright lights lit up the area underneath with the intensity of a floodlight, and the witnesses could see the trees and grass very clearly. For 10 minutes the craft hovered in one place, then it slowly began to drift towards the hotel, giving them a good view of the underneath, and they noted at the bottom of each legs were the pulsating floodlights. Now, this report also appeared in a magazine who also drew a picture, and I'd like to warn you that the picture just gets worse as we go along. So that's a reproduction. I like the detail of the pipe, but the bucket with legs becomes a bit more of a UFO. Okay, the craft then moved slowly away, stopping now and then before gliding on. At one point it moved back to the hotel, but then moved off again. So about 30 minutes of it just floating around doing God knows what. It took off again, accelerating upwards at a 45-degree angle. So they all agreed that during the hovering activity it was silent, but 2 of the witnesses said they heard it buzz or hum as accelerated away. Okay, in May the 28th, 1965, an Ansett airline. Remember Ansett? I've got some cutlery from Ansett Airlines. I reckon that's worth money. Yeah, I use it. Anyway, an Ansett passenger line travelling from Brisbane to Port Moresby was paced for 10 minutes by a UFO at 3:25 a.m. when it was in the Townsville, Cairns area. The captain radioed Townsville Control, described an object that was spherical with a flat top and bottom, and the pilot took a number of pictures. Instructions came by radio shortly afterwards to not have the film developed in New Guinea, but to wait until the pilot returned to Canberra, and upon landing, the film was confiscated, as also was his recording with Townsville Control. That disappeared as well. So now we're up to January 1966, around the same time as the saucer nest appeared in Tully. Another one was found on a farm 2 miles out of Mareeba, where 2 women who'd seen a UFO waded out into the swamp to discover a swirled nest of rotating reeds. Okay, in Mossman, this is an interesting one. We also go back to our chains, of which we know that I've gotten wrong. Oh look, I've got it wrong twice. Okay, a circular patch of scrub in Mossman, north of Cairns, was discovered to have been flattened to the ground. Trees up to 2 to 3 feet in circumference were uprooted, and they were all rotated around the same direction around a circle. The trees and shrubs at the perimeter of the circle were untouched, and there were no tracks in or out. So these are the good examples of the sorts of peculiarities, to say the very least, that were taking place in North Queensland leading up to the Tully nest. So the town of Tully itself, though, was having its own peculiar experiences. So Claire Noble, here's Tully again. Claire Noble, as Cheryl has explained, was a Tully resident who spent a number of years, or in fact probably the whole rest of her life from that point, investigating UFO phenomena in the area. And she wrote a letter in May 1966 after the Tully event where she describes a number of UFO sightings she had herself. In the letter she makes a reference that she doesn't upon regarding the stockmen on the Gulf stations who have become used to the machines going over, and to Aboriginal stories of lights being seen up Tully Gorge and Murray River and on the mountains for many years. So according to a book written in 1967 by Gladys Henry, the Aboriginals called the lights Chickabunna, which apparently translates to devil men, and the lights were most often seen behind the mountains of Tully. So to quote from the book, this is not a picture of the Chickabunna, but it's very close to the description. The Chickabunna was a spirit in the shape of a man and was always sighted rushing through the air. He emitted a strange blue light and was blinding to look upon. When he blue light, the Chickabunna has returned. When he took off from the earth, there was a frightful bang and a roaring, rushing noise. He ate glowing red coals and only came to earth at certain places. The 3 known places in the area where Chickabunna came to ground was Gundala Hill on the Murray River, the large rock at the back of the crest of Mount Tyson. Remember Mount Tyson, where all the UFOs were seen? And another rock up the Davison Valley. Now, there's no evidence of Chickabunna having hurt anybody. So it has hopefully not escaped your notice that one of the Chickabunna's favourite landing places, Mount Tyson, was exactly where a lot of UFOs were seen. So this is a picture of the Tully River. An Aboriginal elder, Jack M, recalled an encounter he had with the Chickabunna as a boy in the 1930s. So the children in the tribe were told not to wander away and not to go down the river in case the Chickabunna got them. And as boys do, they ignored their mother's advice and went down one night and were playing on the riverbank when an enormous ball of light descended from the sky towards them. It was so bright it lit up the entire river as it moved down along the banks, pausing now and then as though it was looking for something. The boys at this point ran off screaming home. During the 1960s, Miss Noble did visit the Aboriginal community, and they told her a lot of stories about UFOs they'd seen in recent years, including seeing a car being chased down the road by a green light. That's my recreation there. Isn't that clever? That's the mad green light in the rear vision mirror. I'm proud of that. Anyway, they saw a car being chased down the road by a green light and another object landing in the swamps again near the barracks. Okay, as a result of her investigations, Miss Noble was able to provide the Bureau with a number of UFO reports from the Tully area prior to 1966. So combined with the reports that were received independently by UFO Research Queensland, they build up quite a picture of UFO landings, sightings and visitations in the area. So we're coming back to Mount Tyson. At 1964, some people travelling in a car observed a most terrifically bright light with jagged edges and emitting rays. Again, the object travelled southwest over Mount Tyson. Again in 1964, travellers in a car. You'd think people would stop going out at night in their cars, wouldn't you? You were startled when a very bright starlight light cruised slowly along on the front right-hand side of the car. The object stayed with the car for 12 miles and was fairly low in the sky. In 1965, a Miss Vivers observed a ball of light on the plains. She also said she often heard the odd noise of the craft going over at night. And in 1965, a Mrs. Anderson looked out her door and saw a flash of light travelling up the Davidson Creek. On the same night, Mr. and Mrs. Morris were travelling home when they saw a ball of light in the Davidson Creek. So we're getting reports that have been corroborated by multiple witnesses. In 1965, a year before Tully Saucer Nest, Mr. O'Shea remembered a similar impression on his farm lagoon, but due to an impending trip, he was too busy to get anyone to look at it, which you do when you're a taciturn farmer. And in 1965, a witness saw light and shadows moving at treetop level and then saw a bright light which went up a nearby mountain. Okay, this one's interesting. October 65, Mrs. Ferguson, a school teacher along with a nearby housewife, observed a light above the school grounds that seemed to be stationary. It was visible for 3 days and nights and remained unmoving. What could that possibly be? And October 16 and 17, 1965, a light was observed moving to and fro horizontally at a location only 4 miles from the Penisi farm. So we're getting closer to January 1966. October 27, 65, a spherical UFO with flashing coloured lights was observed travelling from a garage in town out to the range, and a woman at the same time driving outside of Tully reported the same object. And in November, Charles was sitting in the cabin of his ute when he saw an odd-shaped craft in the sky that was silvery and appeared to be flat on the bottom. So sightings of white and yellow lights basically increased from November 65 up until January 1966 when the Tully Saucer Nest appeared. A very good sighting occurred on November 29th, just a couple of months out of that, when 2 bright lights were observed coming down to land on Lucas Hill. And the characteristics of these UFOs are very familiar to us today. One came down as a straight line, but the other pulsated down as if breathing. The objects rested on the hill, after which the witnesses noticed another 4 to 6 lights were shooting off parallel to the ground. The objects were shaped like plant pots. That's how they described them, and there's a little picture there. They were squarish with a tapered bottom, which we could clearly see with our naked eyes. Only once did these 2 glows move a further distance down the hill, keeping the same distance apart the whole time. Now, so we've built up a picture, hopefully, of UFOs being seen basically from time immemorial by Aboriginals, but probably since the 1930s, and a lot since from between 1956 to 1966. So I'd like to jump ahead now to 1969, which was when the second lot of saucer nests were found at Tully. January 14, 1969, what we'll call the Vass incident. The Vass family were asleep in their caravan, which was parked on the roadside north of Childers, when they were suddenly awakened by the mad barking of the dog. Now, Childers is a long way away from Tully, but I'm including this report here because I think it has an impact on other things that were happening. I'd like to draw attention to the dates there. So we've got Childers, January 14th, February back in Tully, and then March back in Udlo, which is not far from Childers. Okay, Mr. Vass said, "I heard a noise like a big swarm of wasps, only much louder. I rushed around the side of the caravan but could see nothing. Then Maria, the daughter, who had been sleeping near the window, yelled that she could see something above the trees. When I got to the other side of the caravan, the others were outside too. We all saw the spaceship." Okay, the object was estimated to be about 25 to 30 yards in diameter, was shaped like a Mexican sombrero. That's not that UFO, but it's a sombrero-shaped UFO from Norway, I think that one was from. It emitted a violet glow that was mixed with other colours in an opalised effect. As Mr. Vass watched, 3 human-like spacemen, 3 times taller than the average human, but with blocky arms and legs and shapeless bodies, appeared from the craft. Maria Vass recounted that the spacemen emerged from the main craft inside smaller craft that were similar in shape to the larger ship. The spacemen themselves emitted a yellowish glow and seemed unconcerned by the family of observers. As the family watched, the spacemen, now this is not them, but it was the best I could come up with. As the family watched, the spacemen commenced collecting samples of plants and sugarcane from the verge at the side of the road. The specimens were sucked up through a transparent tube and back into the main craft. During the collection process, one of the spacemen moved closer to the family, and Mr. Vass told his daughters to run, but after collecting a few stones, the spaceman moved away again. After approximately 10 minutes of this activity, the spacemen returned to their ship, which rose vertically into the air. Mr. Vass said even after he had gone, we could still hear a faint sound like a single wasp. He also stated that the hair on his head and arms stood up as the object took off. So, there's a object taking off. So the Childers spacemen appeared just 2 months and 200 kilometres away from the Udlo footprints of March 1969. So the question is, were the same occupants, UFO beings, whatever, responsible for both? And were they really adventurous enough to enter a man-made structure, as they did at Udlo for the purposes of specimen gathering? The experience of Mr. Vass and family certainly suggests that these spacemen were not overly concerned with contact by human beings. So, back up in the Tully area at Silky Oak, in 1970, a Mr. Lentini was awakened at 4 a.m. by his dog, which was making a lot of noise and had woken the baby. Recall the Vass incident with the dog barking and being woken up in the night. And also the dog barked during the Tully incidents as well. Lentini could hear a loud humming sound, again, just like the Vass incident we just heard earlier, which he at first thought was his refrigerator, but the fridge was okay and he realised the noise was coming from outside the house. By now the children and the wife had woken up hearing the same noise, so they found that the noise seemed to be coming from a bright light that was hovering about 5 degrees above the eastern horizon. It was rising slowly and pulsing, a change in colour from white to red and back again. It seemed to be spherical at first, but later changed to a cigar shape, and then changed later again to the shape of a Mexican sombrero, which we just saw a picture of. So that event took place 2 years after the Childers sighting, but there's a similarity there, I think. So the object that the Lentinis were looking at was visible for 2 hours until the sun rose. The Lentinis' neighbour also saw it and came over to talk about it. 10 minutes after that, 2 smaller lights appeared, one moving from the north towards the first and another appeared to the south. A 4th light then appeared in the sky in the direction of Hinchinbrook Island. Okay, again we're reminded of Mr. Vass's sombrero-shaped UFO where the occupants emerged from the main craft inside smaller craft. Could this have been a similar event where he was witnessing the smaller scout ships, for any want of a better word, returning from their specimen collecting, disappearing men? Maybe they went to the Blue Mountains to collect people. Anyway, another sugarcane train. It's not safe to drive sugarcane trains. Okay, a train control officer attempted to contact a sugarcane locomotive by radio and received an excited but incoherent response from the 2 drivers. Fearing an accident, a rescue party was dispatched. This was serious business. One of the rescue party observed an intensely bright light in an area where burnt cane was later found. When the rescue party found the train, the driver and fireman appeared stupefied, with one of them pointing to the sky. Both of them were taken to hospital where it was reported they said they'd seen an object in the field. I don't know what upset them so much though. So that's 1971. And in 1971, back on the Panisi farm, the UFO monitor was again triggered and another nest was found with the same hallmarks as everyone that had come before it. So nests continued to be found at the Panisi farm for years, and according to a report by Claire Noble, it's estimated around 54 nests alone were found on the Panisi farm in the 20 years after 1966. So they visited regularly but sporadically. And more nests were found at other lagoons in the area, bringing the total to 86. However, they are only the reported nests. How many more were not reported? How many more were not even found? That's the mystery. That's the Dora's Lagoon saucer nest, which appeared in 1975. And there was another report from 1981 when Max, remember Max with his ice cream cone shaped UFO? That UFO made another reappearance along the Jarrah Creek Road. And 1980s was another decade of, the 1970s reports seemed to diminish quite a bit in Tully, but during the 1980s they increased again in the area. I'm not going into the 1980s because there are quite a number, possibly in the hundreds, reported. So we're just not going there. But I'd like to point out that in 1987 at Deerall, which is not far from Tully, 80 kilometres, Michel Desmarquet disappeared from his home for 9 days. When he returned, he claimed he'd been transported to a planet called spelt Theauba, pronounced Jehovah, which will escape no one's notice, rhymes with Jehovah, which Desmarquet said was situated in the Pleiades system in a parallel universe to our own. A lot of people have read this book, I'm sure. I actually haven't, and I don't want to. So it was a very popular book. It was in every book, so I remember it, and that's probably why I don't want to read it. He described how he was taken to this planet in a blue spherical spaceship by 3-metre tall human-like beings with blonde hair. Now, it might be pushing it to find a connection with Desmarquet's tall humanoids and the other beings and UFOs that have been reported from the Tully area during the previous 2 decades. And in particular, Mr. Vassar's occupants, the spacemen, which were 3 times taller than a human and I suspect wearing some kind of protective suit. That maybe if they took the suit off, they might have been blonde underneath. That's a theory. So the decade from 1956 to 1966 saw a marked increase of UFO encounters, and given the range of sightings described, the numbers of landing sites, the sightings of landed objects both day and night, and the observation of at least one family that the occupants of a landed craft were gathering specimens, it's hard to escape the conclusion that at least some of the UFOs seen were occupied by beings on a fact-finding mission to Earth, and particularly Queensland. But what about the rest of Australia? So we're leaving Tully, but we're staying in 1966, the year of the Tully saucer nest. Turns out that 1966 wasn't just strange Queensland. Down in New South Wales and Victoria, they were also having their share of ufological oddities. In Victoria, in particular, a mini but very spectacular UFO wave commenced on April 2nd, 1966, just 3 months after the Tully saucer nest appeared, and it concluded 4 days later on April the 6th, 1966. So the start of our wave is the Baldwin Bell. Who's heard of the Baldwin Bell? You don't answer these questions. So this is Baldwin, to the east of Melbourne. So at 2:00 a.m. on Saturday, the 2nd of April 1966, a man photographed an image of what later becomes known as the Baldwin Bell. The camera used was a Polaroid, which is hard to fake stuff on a Polaroid, and the photo was investigated thoroughly by the Victorian Flying Saucer Research Society and the CSIRO, and declared by both to be a genuine photograph of an anomalous object, although admittedly some doubt about its authenticity still lingers. A sonic boom was reported to have been heard in the minutes after the sighting. Okay, 2 days after that, we get to April 4th, 1966, and we get to the bent light of Burke's Flat. Who's heard of that? Don't answer. So, 2 days after that, a man named Ron Sullivan, who was a Queenslander, was travelling on the Dunolly St Arnaud Road, just out of Burke's Flat. His attention was drawn to the field on his right where he saw an odd light, a peculiar phosphorus light that played across the ground. In Ron's words, the object opened up and there was another white oval on top of it, about 30 feet in height, coming down in the shape of a cone with a 15 feet bottom diameter. So remembering our ice cream cone object? In the cone were tubes of coloured lights, all the lights you see as you look through the spectrum, travelling up and down, going up and down in shafts. Again, Max's ice cream cone shaped craft had coloured lights, all the spectrum colours in it. Okay, Max didn't provide as much detail for his sighting because he was too shocked. apart from it being cone-shaped and the lights being all colours of the spectrum and rolling around, but it's similar enough to Ron's encounter that I think it's safe to say the same object was seen 7 years later and quite a distance away. So when Max saw this object back in Tully in 1959, he was so stunned that he immediately entered his house and tried to forget all about it. Poor old Ron, however, was stuck in his car going really quickly down the highway, which is when things took an unexpected turn. When he took his eyes off the light in the field, he saw that the beams of his headlights were now pointed towards the right, straight towards the object in the paddock, the ice cream cone-shaped object. As he proceeded along the road, the headlight beams bent at an even more extreme angle, still aiming themselves towards the object in the field. The effect of this was to make Ron believe his car was now heading off the road and towards the object in the paddock, so he compensated by spinning the steering wheel abruptly to the left. As the light bending was an optical illusion, this meant Ron was really aiming his car towards a tree on the left side of the road. Fortunately, he saw that in time, compensated, and went back in the direction he was meant to be travelling. Ron said nothing about this until 2 days later, on April the 6th, when a motorist was killed on an accident on the same stretch of road. This led Ron to report the incident, and he accompanied police to the site and found that the dead man's car had collided with the very same tree he had nearly collided with. Investigating the field in which the light was seen, a depression was found in the dirt. It was circular, about 1 metre wide, and seemed to have been made by earth being removed from the ground, not from an object being pressed into it. The farmer who owned the field said that the depression hadn't been there when he ploughed it. There were no tracks in the field. So, this day, April the 6th, the day a man may or may not have been killed as a result of a UFO bending his headlights, the very same day, oh my God, Westall. Everyone heard of Westall? So, on the very same day, the children of the Westall State High School were having a close encounter of quite a different kind. At around 11 o'clock in the morning, a group of students and their teacher were on the school's oval when the flying saucer made an appearance. The object was described as being round, saucer-shaped, purplish grey and about twice as large as a car. It was said to have flown over the electricity pylons, and there's some great sketches from the Westall 66 documentary, which if you haven't seen, you ought to. It flew over the pylons, and some witnesses there were two smaller craft that hovered on the road in front of the school. The larger craft was said to have landed in a nearby paddock, while the other two were said to have passed over the school in a southwest direction. By the time the main craft had landed, the majority of the school had exited to watch the mystery object, and it's estimated there were about 200 witnesses. So that object stayed landed for about 20 minutes, giving the witnesses plenty of time to observe it. As it lifted off, it was described as rising into the air and tilting to show its underside, just like George Pedley's UFO in Tully in 1966. Okay, during the 20 minutes that the craft was landed, there's another picture, the pylons and the crows seemed to be big in the children's memories. The police were contacted. The police called the military, and shortly afterwards 2 trucks loaded with military personnel descended on the scene, cordoned off the landing site and investigated the area. Some reports say that after the investigation, the military burnt the area so that no traces of the landing remained. Unfortunately for the military, the reporters got there first, and they ran a series of front-page articles. And recent interest in the event has uncovered even more witnesses' information. So one of the newer witnesses to come forward was Shane Matthews, who saw the UFO landing not far from him. In an interview in 2005, he said, "I saw the thing come across the horizon and drop down behind the pine trees. I couldn't tell you what it was. It certainly wasn't a light aircraft. I saw the thing drop down behind the trees and saw it leave again. I went over and there was a circle in the clearing. It looked like it had been cooked or boiled, not burnt as I remember." So Kevin Hurley, a student at Monash Uni, was also living nearby when he was alerted of the UFO landing. He jumped on his push bike, rode to the landing site, and along with other witnesses, discovered a flattened circle of grass twisted down in a radial pattern. So there's the Victorian map of events in those 4 days in early April. So is there a connection or a coincidence? Could there be a connection with the events of Tully and what was happening in Victoria? I suggest that the cone-shaped object that was seen in Tully and Burke is the same object. I think that the description of the Tully UFO rising into the air and tilting on its side is the same as that of the Westall UFO. And the Westall UFO left a swirled patch of boiled grass that may or may not match the saucer nests of Tully. While there seem to be, and I don't know for sure, I'd say that there are, but there seem to be no reports of saucer nests in bodies of water from Victoria. I think they existed, they were either never reported, and to be honest, I haven't got access to the Victorian UFO reports. However, a few reports of saucer nests came from New South Wales, and unsurprisingly, they all come from the early months of 1966. So in Bankstown on February 14, a 19-foot circle of reeds was found swirled in a clockwise direction in a swamp. The reeds were not broken, but in this case a chemical smell was said to be in the air. There were no tracks leading in or out, and the smell dissipated the next day. There was some corroborating evidence in this case, because a lot of people in the neighbouring suburbs had seen lights hovering over Bankstown for an hour. That's a picture of it. So in Culcairn, we don't have an exact date, but between February and March 1966, a series of 7 circular nests were found on a property, the largest of which measured 11 feet across, and the rest measuring 5 feet across, which is similar to the Tully pattern, a large nest and a series of smaller nests. This is not a photo of the Culcairn nest, but it is a New South Wales crop circle. Or not, it's not a crop circle, no, it's a saucer nest, but I don't know where from. Then on May the 22nd in Corndale, we have another flattened oval of grass that was 22 feet long by 16 feet wide. There was no evidence of burning, and the grass was depressed to a depth of 10 inches. A UFO had been reported the night prior that was round red and glowing. So there's a map detailing where the nests and flying saucers had been seen between January 1966 and May 1966. So am I making connections out there, do you think? I don't know. The patterns of sightings and the similarity of ground traces indicates, I think with some certainty, that Tully and other parts of the eastern seaboard of Australia were a base of operations, for want of a better word, for a particular type of UFO that appeared to like flattening our grass and landing in our swamps. And there's the date pattern for the main nest and the UFOs between January and May 1966. Interesting thing is the UFO, whatever this was, back then they didn't seem to be as shy as the UFOs of today. They were regularly observed during daylight hours. They didn't mind landing close to people, and they made a big enough splash, no pun intended, that the military were forced into action whether they liked it or not. So it's the military response that leads us to the next part of our rapidly expanding mystery. And now for something completely different. I'm heading off into wacky land now. Okay, as if all this wasn't coincidental enough, something else happened in 1966 that elevates all of this to a state of high peculiarity. LBJ. Lyndon B. Johnson became president of the US on the 22nd November 1963 when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. So here's a picture of Lyndon Johnson being sworn in. Most people will be aware of the accusations that LBJ may have been behind the assassination. The Russians are pretty sure of it. He was described as power hungry, accused of having been murdered, and there were plenty of other scandals. Here's one scandal. Has everyone seen this photo? So immediately after he's sworn in, he turns to his good friend, congressman, who's winking at him. And you can see from here that he's having a big grin. His wife can barely contain her glee. Okay, so just 9 months after the Tully saucer nest, President Johnson made a strange and unexpected visit to Townsville on October 23rd, 1966. There's LBJ with PM Harold Holt, who, as we know, disappeared. LBJ was on his way to the Philippines to seek support for the Vietnam War, which Australia had already entered 4 years before in 1962. The point is, he didn't need to seek support, he already had his support. According to internet sources, Johnson's security advisor advised him not to stop in Australia at all. It was a pointless exercise, and it was a presidential visit during a period of intense war, but he came anyway. He insisted on it. So that's him in Canberra on October the 21st. So he landed in Canberra on October the 21st. He went to the dentist. He moved to Melbourne and Sydney and arrived in Brisbane on October the 22nd. So that's one day, 4 cities and a dentist, basically in 24 hours. He stopped in at Townsville a day later on October the 23rd. So he gave a whole day to Townsville and just 24 hours to 4 major cities, basically, on a visit that was supposed to be seeking support. Why would he make such a huge effort to visit Townsville? Well, the official reason was that one of nostalgia. So back in World War II, LBJ had landed in Townsville on the way to a bombing raid in Port Moresby. Does anybody know that? It's interesting when you get going. When he was in Townsville back then, he spent a few happy days at Buchanan's Hotel, which had been taken over by American forces and was being used as officers' quarters. So supposedly in 1966, he wanted to revisit the place. Sounds good in theory, but it would have been 20 years since the last time he visited. The officers he'd spent time with were long gone. And more interesting, Tully is only 210 kilometres north of Townsville, and there had been, and there still was, an enormous wave of UFO sightings taking place in the area right at that time. So, in case you think, that's Buchanan's back in the 60s, in case you think I'm making too much out of this, let's continue. There's LBJ, Wernher von Braun, and President Kennedy. So in the 1960s, Johnson was a senator, and he was a member of the Special Committee on Space and Aeronautics, as well as the Senate Committee on Aeronautical and Space Sciences. When he became vice president, Kennedy appointed Johnson the chairman of the National Aeronautics and Space Council. Still in 1960, as a vice presidential candidate, there's LBJ at the inception of NASA. He was involved with the study of unexplained aerial phenomenon, UAPs, i.e. UFOs. This study that he commissioned involved experts from a variety of scientific backgrounds and was overseen by an advisor on military and NASA affairs who concluded that UAPs were advanced technology from somewhere other than Earth. Okay, still in 1960, Johnson wrote to Donald Keyhoe, so we've all heard of him, pilot, author, UFO researcher and the director of NECAP, to advise, and these are Johnson's words verbatim, the staff of the Preparedness Investigating Subcommittee, whatever that is keeping a close watch over new developments in this field with standing instructions to report to me any recent significant sightings of unidentified flying objects, along with an analysis of the conduct of the Air Force investigation of each sighting. So given Johnson's formal request to Keyhoe, the military investigation of the Tully event, not to mention the involvement of the military in the Westall event, could not possibly have escaped his notice. Both events were significant with witnesses and ground tracers. Both had been reported in the Australian and international press, and both had been officially investigated by the Air Force and, in the case of Tully, by the US Navy. And Johnson had an interest in UFOs and space that extended back to his time as a senator. So way back in 1958, Johnson delivered a political speech on the importance of controlling technology in space. That's him again. He clearly didn't like anybody being out there. His speech read, in part, control of space means control of the world, far more certainly, far more totally than any control that has ever or could ever be achieved by weapons or by troops of occupation. The race we are in, or which we must enter, is not the race to perfect long-range ballistic missiles. There is something more important than any ultimate weapon. That is the ultimate position. The position of total control over Earth lies somewhere out in space. So, given all of that, could he really have gone out of his way to visit Townsville just for the sake of nostalgia? Or is it possible he visited Townsville while he was conveniently in the neighbourhood to meet Air Force officials and attain an in-depth briefing on the events that were taking place in the area and which the RAAF had so recently investigated? What do you think?
That one.
Yeah. Absolutely. Now we have got time. I just got a little aside on the nature of fate. Before we leave Lyndon Johnson, I'd just like to point out that he stopped in Townsville in 1942, and on the morning of the Port Moresby raid, he was assigned to the bomber, the Virginian. According to naval records, he forgot his camera and left the aircraft to find it. When he returned, he found that one certain Colonel Stevens had taken his place and that Johnson had been reassigned to the Heckling Hare. As they departed Port Moresby after the bombing raid, the Virginian crashed into the water off Salamua, killing all on board. If Johnson had been on that plane, as originally planned, he would have died in 1942. John F. Kennedy may have survived. The world might be a vastly different place. So, next, we're going back in time to Nambour in 1932, before the Big Pineapple. Okay, an unexpected precursor to the Tully saucer nest occurred in Nambour, which is a long way south of Sully, but only about 100k north of Brisbane. So while no saucer nest was reported, possibly because the witness didn't think to look, being too surprised by the appearance of the object, the form and the appearance of the saucer over the lagoon is too similar to that being seen by George Pedley all over the Horseshoe Lagoon to be mere coincidence. So this is a patch of reeds. The sighting occurred at approximately 2 p.m, the time of year about the end of March, early April 1932 or 1933. The weather was mild and fine, with occasional white cloud and the breeze from the southeast. The town was Nambour. The spot was about a half-mile west of the town. The area of the sighting was on a small creek running through the family farm, and there was a small swampy area just to one side of the creek. There was a small hill around the base of which the swampy pools lay. It is a rather odd-shaped hill, and it is definitely not joined to the large hill close to it. The pools of water separate them. I was playing with a group of boys and girls in the vicinity of this hill, and I wandered some distance from them and approached a tall growth of grass which grew all around the edge of the small pool of water. I put both hands up in front of me and parted the tall grass to look through. I heard a low humming sound and saw a round object directly in front of me, about 4 feet away. It looked the same shape as if two ordinary saucers were placed face to face and then turned on their sides. There was a small circle around the top of the upper dome of the object. The area in this circle, about 3/4 of the way up the top dome, was curved upwards into a smaller dome. The colour of the object was the same shade of silver grey as a Canberra bomber looks on a dull, rainy, overcast day. The size of the object was 12 feet in diameter. It hovered 3 feet above the surface of the water. There was a slight, almost imperceptible shiver of the water surface directly below the object, as if it was directing a force directly downwards in order to stay in the air. It was not a draft of air as from a jet engine, as the waves going outwards in concentric circles directly below the object were so small in height as to amount to no more than a shivering of the surface. The object remained perfectly still over the same spot, 3 feet above the surface of the water. There was a very high-speed shiver motion of the object, as if a gyrostabilizer of some kind were keeping it upright. So I think that description of the shape of the object closely matches that of George Pedley's. As I bent forward to look more closely, the humming sound rose suddenly in pitch and volume, and at the same time a whitish mist began to form between me and the object. I did not see any holes from which it came, and I think it was some form of an electronic mist. I could still see through it, like one can see through a nylon cloth woven very fine. At the same time as the mist began to form, I felt a tight feeling in the head, and as the noise increased I let go of the tall grass and stepped back. I could not see it anymore, and I felt stunned in the head, but I could still hear it humming behind the tall grass. I did not see any holes or vents in the upper surface of the object. It was smooth all the way around. There were no seams welded or rivets to be seen, no hatches or light housings. I did not see any flashing lights, and when I looked closer at it, I could see the bottom area was free from any rounded bumps or landing gear. I did not touch it or get closer than 4 feet at any time. That night I noticed large white blisters on both of my hands, and I felt out of sorts. Sometime during the night, most of the blisters burst, and 1 or 2 remaining burst during the day, and a clear fluid like water came out. I felt better after that. So what do we think of that one?
When did you write that?
That was written in, I think, in the 60s. Back. So is this the end? No, Cheryl, it's not. After 2 decades of a fluctuating period of intensity and following the last intense wave of the 80s, The reed circles of the Tully nest seem to slowly fade away. This is Claire Noble, by the way, our Tully representative, who left an enormous heavy box of stuff that I can't pick up now since I broke my back. Sporadic reports continue to trickle in. So here we've got some newspapers from reports from the 1980s. The reports continue to trickle in as they've done both prior and post-Tully, but where did the reed swirling UFOs disappear to? Probably they haven't gone anywhere. There's some more. Okay, the seeming evolution of the UFO phenomenon is often pointed out by researchers. So we've got the Adamski type UFOs of the 50s giving way to saucer-shaped designs, cigar-shaped craft, triangular craft, spheres, squares, rectangles, balls of light, you name it, somebody's reported it. I've got a slide of that somewhere. So there's a... No, I think so. It's disturbing me. So there's a sample of the types of UFOs. Someone should probably sit down and draw pictures of the Tully UFOs that happened. Similarly, the occupants of the craft have changed appearance from the Nordic blondes through to the mantids, reptilians, greys, you name it. It's the tip of a very large iceberg. So it does appear that Earth's being visited by constant and successive waves of ET visitors. Some of them choosing to hang around for a bit, as we've seen in the Tully, and some of them, probably the smart ones, quickly moving on. So whatever was happening, whatever is happening, it seems that for some period of time, extraterrestrials with cloven feet made Tully their base of operations. That they'd been in Queensland before is in no doubt. The Nambour report from the 1930s indicates that this type of UFO had been in Queensland for quite some time, and the Chickabunna stories certainly point to Mount Tyson and Tully being a long-standing base of operations. That they visited other parts of Queensland and Australia during the 1960s, I think, is fairly apparent. For some reason, the craft got bolder in 1965 and 1966 and went into a hiatus for a while, possibly due to the military interest in their activities. They made a comeback in 1969 and then moved on for a bit. But they do drop in on us from time to time, leaving traces of their visits. So there's all the different kinds of UFOs that we've got drawings of from Tully. The months leading up to and including 1966 provided the highest number of UFO sightings so far seen in Queensland, and in fact the whole of Australia at that time. Those numbers of sighting wouldn't be matched for about another 30 years till the 1990s, I think. There's a question. We can only conjecture about the reasons for the 1966 visits. Maybe at the end of this people can give ideas what they're thinking. Were the UFOs siphoning water from the lagoons? If water was what they wanted, why use a muddy lagoon? Why not use, we've got plenty of nice clean clear water. And if it wasn't water they were after, why land on a lagoon? Colin's got a theory about that. They weren't averse to being seen by humans. They did nothing to cover up the tracks they were leaving behind. Were they maybe on the brink of making contact? Was Albert Panisi's farm a nice place because Albert left them alone? What about Westall? Were they about to make contact until a horde of screaming children ran across the field and scared them away? Will we ever know? And that's my head after thinking about this. It's going to take a bigger mind than mine to find the answer to this mystery, but I think now with the benefit of time and of hindsight, we can see a glimmer, and it is just a glimmer of the bigger picture. There is a huger picture here, and we just don't have all the information. And ultimately, if George Panisi had not seen that UFO, and if he had not called the police, we would never have seen this picture at all. So that is the end of this horrendous little thing.